Hello, Upper Sixth. Here's an illegible photo of an illegible diagram on the desk about the idea of hypocrisy and seeming in Measure for Measure. I'm going to talk through how I would approach an essay on this topic. I'm going to be fairly broad on this matter, so what I say might not necessarily be rigorously on the theme of hypocrisy itself, but I'll try to encompass the idea of disguise and also appearance versus reality. So these are related ideas. In my introduction, I would most likely try to set up the critical debate immediately and link it to the idea of Measure for Measure as a problem play. Measure for Measure is classed as a problem play, as you know, because of its moral ambiguity and the fact that it mixes both comic and tragic Renaissance theatrical conventions. The idea of hypocrisy and seeming, it seems to me to encapsulate this critical debate, this tension between comedy and tragedy. On the one hand, disguise is a very common comic convention used in plays such as Twelfth Night. On the other hand, the idea of appearance versus reality, reminiscent of other Shakespearean tragedies such as Macbeth, is used for Shakespeare to undergo a serious examination of the problems in contemporary London through his use, of course, of the setting of Vienna. So this theme of hypocrisy, seeming, appearance versus reality in many ways sums up the critical debate of Measure for Measure as a problem play. Okay, so what examples then shall we go through? How shall we structure this essay? I'd probably structure this quite simply in terms of characters. I'd have a section about Angelo, a section about the Duke, and a section about others, other characters, with Lucio as an ironic parallel, as an ironic contrast, I should really say. So let's look at Angelo. I'm going to pause in some places as I find references in my playtext. I'm using the same edition as you'll be using for the exam, the rather horrible Dover Thrift edition. Okay, so Angelo. Angelo, of course, is presented at the start as an exaggerated Puritan stereotype. As we said today, we would link to the AO3, the contemporary fears of a Puritan influence in administration, dating back from uncertainty about the about who would succeed Elizabeth I when she was getting old. It's immediately made clear that seeming is a major part of Angelo's new role as taking on the Duke's authority. Look at the Duke's explanation of things in Act 1, Scene 3, pages 10 to 11. After the Duke explains why he's put Angelo in charge because of the breakdown in law and order, and so on, it's immediately clear that what Angelo is doing is taking on the Duke's authority. He is acting as the Duke. he is seeming. We see this in the final couplet. Hence shall we see, if power change purpose, what our seemers be. The Duke deliberately uses these words to invite the audience to be looking out for how successfully Angelo does exercise this authority, how truly he is exercising the role, and so on. Very, very shortly afterwards, though, on page 13, Act 1, Scene 4, Lucio gives us further information about Lord Angelo, which confirms the sense that we need to watch out for Angelo. Page 13. Lord Angelo, a man whose blood is very snowbroth, one who never feels the wanton stings and motions of the sense, but doth rebate and blunt his natural edge. And later on, we see that he scarce confesses his appetite is more to bread than stones. Angelo being portrayed as an extreme version of a Puritan. Notice Shakespeare's hyperbole here. Scarce confesses his appetite is more to bread than the stones. This, said by the Duke, is actually another biblical allusion to the temptation of Christ in the wilderness when he was fasting 40 days and 40 nights. The devil came and tempted him and said, if you be the Son of God, change these stones into bread. Angelo scarce confesses his appetite is more to bread than stones. Angelo is essentially denying his humanity. He is doing something that's totally impossible. And so this, in a way itself, can be seen as seeming, as almost a disguise. If he is truly human, or he is truly human, but scarce confesses his appetite, etc., etc., one of those extreme holier-than-thou Puritans, then inevitably it's as if he is being set up to fail. It's as if Shakespeare is deliberately presenting him as an extreme version in order to set up a situation whereby this disguise of holiness and almost lack of humanity falls off, as it were. Linking to our critics, this reminds me particularly of Walter Kerr in the Features of Comedy, the comic incongruity. The quote here is, King of infinite space, man is in fact bounded in a nutshell. The idea that, quote, a bishop should not have to go to the bathroom. The basic joke is that someone who is so elevated and intellectual and spiritual is ultimately bounded by physical reality. If Angelo is denying this physical reality, then comedy is going to expose this. And of course, this is what ends up happening. So after Shakespeare's characters describe Angelo in this way, we then see this being undercut by Angelo's temptation. Of course, temptation is a tragic convention, a convention of Renaissance tragedy. So this is page 27, end of Act 2, Scene 2. Now, while in some ways this realization of his temptation, I suppose, is it can be seen to support Kerr in as much as we've got almost literally a bishop having to go to the bathroom to use his example. He is being reminded of the indignities and physical limitations of life, as Kerr says. He's finally seeing his own latent sexuality. Remember, I'm going a little off task. Remember in our session on sex and sexuality, we commented on how a psychoanalytical critic would immediately look for signs of latent sexuality in characters who are sexually repressed, such as Angelo and indeed Isabella. Where were we? Yes. Okay, yeah, on the one hand, Angelo's sexuality... I have to choose my words very carefully here. Making itself known can be seen as comic, but remember, this is only in retrospect, really. It's very hard to see the comic conventions in Measure for Measure in Acts 1 to 3 until we already know the play. For Shakespeare's audience seeing it for the first time... yes, there are comic conventions in the brothel scenes and so on, the bawdy repartee, the humour, but of course there's humour in Shakespeare's tragedies. They would have recognised they would have recognised Angelo being tempted. They would have recognised the use of the soliloquy, which is a very distinctive Renaissance tragic convention. Said by a character making a decision or undergoing some sort of turmoil. That's what we associate with tragedy. So even though this could be interpreted as comically, the fact that this reminds us so much of Shakespeare's other tormented protagonists, such as Macbeth, if 'twere done, then when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly, and so on. Is this a dagger which I see before me, and so on and so on and so on. The fact it reminds us of that makes us think, oh, tragedy. So this is where Angelo's disguise is slipping, and the effect this has on his personality, his reality being asserted. Notice, of course, that before this point, he's disguising himself from himself, not just everyone else. And this, of course, is apparent in the language in his soliloquy. Soliloquies, remember, are very good for AO2. The repeated rhetorical questions. Is this her fault or mine? What's this? What's this? Repeated questions. Exclamations. Oh, fi. The slightly disrupted syntax. Picture equals there. Oh, fi. The disruption to the iambic pentameter and so on. All these things that show extremes of commotion. The imagery of corruption, the exaggerated imagery of corruption. Not she, nor doth she tempt, but it is I that, lying by the violet in the sun, do as the carrion does, not as the flower, corrupt with virtuous season. All this imagery of corruption. Yes, bodily corruption is something referred to biblically, but he is taking this image to extremes. So that's Angelo's reality asserting itself. Moving on then, how this sense of deceiving himself, this sense of seeming, is continued. Act 2, Scene 4, the confrontation between Angelo and Isabella. Notice at the start of this scene, Act 2, Scene 4, we're on page 29 now, there is a sense of seeming even in Angelo's soliloquy. When I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. Heaven hath my empty words, whilst my invention, hearing not my tongue, anchors in Isabel. Heaven in my mouth, as if I did but only chew his name, and in my heart the strong and swelling evil of my conception. Sorry, basic error there. I stopped reading at the end of the line and I didn't look for the punctuation mark. and the fact that the sentence continued over the page. Shame on me. Don't do that. And in my heart, the strong and swelling evils on the page of my conception. Right. Heaven in my mouth, as if I did but only chew his name. When Angelo has been praying about this, as a good Puritan, he has been unable to do so sincerely. The idea that as if I did but only chew his name, this use of the simile, as if he is deceiving the heavens, deceiving God, is quite significant, although he is at least acknowledging his hypocrisy here. Angelo then and Isabella. And his manipulation of Isabella. Now, we've discussed this in Acts 2, scene 4. Bearing in mind the different ways they refer to what Angelo wants Isabel to do. Towards the end of the scene, page 34, when Angelo's intents become clear, he says, "Believe me on mine honour, my words express my purpose." Isabel: "Ha, little honour to be much believed, and most pernicious purpose, seeming. How interesting that she does not call him out, as it were, for his attempt to manipulate her, for his attempts to undermine the law and justice which he has been put in place to exercise. She is focusing on his hypocrisy. So, to Isabel and to all the characters, outward appearances are important, and crucially, if the outward appearance is different to the inner reality, then that is something that needs to be addressed. So there is much, therefore, to discuss about how this idea is relevant to Angelo. Next section then, the Duke. Okay, so immediately we can link to both criticism and to contexts. Yes, the Duke is very often linked to King James I. Okay, very easy point to make. But make sure you mention the critic Brockbank, the Duke's manipulation of events in Measure for Measure. His argument that, quote, the Duke becomes an extension of the playwright. The idea that the fantastical Duke is a trickster too. That his power is so great that he is a playwright of sorts. The great Shakespearean critic F.R. Leavis remarks that what one makes of the ending of Measure for Measure depends on what one makes of the Duke. And arguably, his statement could be said to apply to the entire play. What we make of Measure for Measure as a whole depends on what we make of the Duke. It seems that the Duke is very aware of what he is doing. From the moment that he reveals his intent in Act 1, Scene 3, he says, I prithee supply me with the habit, and instruct me how I may formally in person bear me like a true friar. We have got at least two terms here that refer specifically to our theme of seeming. How I may formally means in outward form, in person, bear me like a true friar. Hold on, this sentence is absolutely full of words like that. How I may formally, in person, that means in outward person, in appearance. Bear me, the way you bear yourself, is the way you present yourself, and then finally, like a true friar. Such a loaded few lines here. So the Duke is very clear that he is disguising himself. He knows he is doing it. And what the Duke proceeds to do is quite often very morally ambiguous. He himself admits, craft against device I must apply, in his speech at the end of Act 3, Scene 2. He is constantly telling lies. Remember, he actually has Isabella believe that Claudio has been executed. Notes her extreme reaction, "Oh, I will to him and pluck out his eyes," revealing the depths of her emotional torment over this, well, quite understandably so. He uses the bed trick of questionable morality, despite the fact that it is ultimately from the Bible. And indeed, he switches the heads of, he substitutes the head of Ragozine for Claudio's. We talked earlier about the moral and spiritual implications of the Duke taking on the disguise of an ordained Roman Catholic priest, and it seems going to prisons and administering the sacraments of confession and what we call the last rites, extreme unction, the anointing of those who are about to die. Would he have done that to Barnardine if Barnardine had consented, as it were, to being executed? Yet, although that scene in the prison is played very comically, it does throw up some very, very disturbing moral questions. And the Duke's use of this disguise, then, is highly ironic and morally complex. His disguise is being used to expose another's. His sins, as it were, as minor as though they might be, and his hypocrisy, as minor as though it might be, is being used to expose Angelo's hypocrisy. He is essentially committing a fairly minor evil act. I hesitate to use the word evil, but he does lie. He does do these things which are morally ambiguous, but he does those for the greater good. It's ironic that this is what exposes Angelo's hypocrisy. And so this leads us to Brockbank once again. The Duke is a playwright, as it were. He is manipulative. He provides a theatrical solution, which seemingly carries on right to the end in Act 5. It is rather like a Stuart masque, Masque, a ritualistic show that's mostly full of visual spectacle, music, and so on, designed to entertain a royal court. And we allow ourselves to be taken in by this in a way that perhaps leads us to forget the moral complexity of the play. Moving quickly on and speeding up a bit now, once you have looked at the Duke, you could finish with a little bit about Lucio, perhaps as a nice contrast. Now, although it is perhaps overly simplistic to interpret Lucio's name, as the Latin would imply, as meaning he is the bringer of light, the bringer of truth. In a sense, he really is. And Lucio, apart from his hidden backstory, which actually he himself admits, the one that involved him getting a prostitute pregnant, Lucio is the most truthful character of them all. Yes, there is a dark side to him. He slanders the Duke, although this is done in a very funny way. And of course, slander in Jacobean times, was a very serious offence that could actually lead to capital punishment. Although, of course, we wonder if there is truth in Lucio's allegations. However, what Lucio does not do is judge others. Ironically, it's Lucio who embodies "Judge not that ye be not judged" from the Sermon on the Mount. He is therefore unlike the Duke, Angelo, and Isabella in that respect. It is then even more ironic that it is Lucio who, as the Duke says, is the first knave that ever made a Duke. That he is the one who reveals the Duke's disguise, who unveils the Duke at the end. He is the bringer of truth. And particularly perhaps to a contemporary audience, it is when we see Lucio in the brothels and so on, that we are given a realistic sense of what it is actually like in Shakespeare's contemporary Vienna, which, as we know, stands for contemporary London. To finish, you would no doubt focus on Act 5. What is the overall impression with which you are left at the end of the play, and how has Shakespeare used hypocrisy, seeming, and appearance versus reality in order to give you that lasting impression? No more from me. Good luck tomorrow.